Hi everybody, here I am in my study where it all happens. Thank you all for asking such great questions and I'll do my very best to answer them. Several of you asked how I actually got into writing, and I'm going to kick off with a question from Lynn, who asks, how did I start and did I always know I wanted to write? Well, Lynn, the answer is yes, I definitely knew I wanted to write from more or less as soon as I could read a book or hold a pen or a pencil. In fact, my first writing exercise was writing up the walls of the stairs in our house in Liverpool when I was a toddler. But writing properly, my first attempt at writing a novel was in 1992, and it was a thriller set in Istanbul. I've lost most of it now. I never got round to finishing it because I was still working full time, doing a lot of travelling. I just didn't have the time or headspace to make it happen. So the first of my published books was A Greater World, and I began that in 1999 when I left my last sort of big corporate job and started to work as an independent management consultant. And so I could organise my time a bit better. And I made a trip to Australia, and while I was there, I fell in love with the place and thought, I'm going to set a novel here. So that was how I kicked off with, so that would be about 17 years ago. And it took me a good, I would think it took me about 10 years to really get going on it, and then probably another 5 or 6 before it was ready for publishing. And I had a lot of help from my agent in the early days to help me get the book into shape. Next question is from Anita in Cape Town, and she asks, do you work out the entire plot in your head first or not? And I guess it's a little bit yes and a little bit no. With A Greater World, I actually sat down to write that without a clue what it was going to be about, who was in it, what would happen, nothing. I just sat there and started with what ended up being chapter 2, and I just came up with this situation and then let the characters take over. It took me an awful long time, and one of the lessons I learned was to be flying that much from the seat of my pants was not a very good idea. So since then, I've always tried to map a rough outline and go from there. And from time to time, I will depart from that, because what tends to happen is the characters take over and pull me in a different direction. But at least I've got a roadmap from which I can depart. So I wouldn't repeat what I did with The Greater World again, because it just took such a lot of time, a lot of rewriting, a lot of rethinking. So yes, start with a skeleton and then flesh it out. Barbara from Essex in England asks, what catches my interest first, the era or the location? That's a real tough one, Barbara. I would say mostly it's probably the location. And then as I start to think about what might have happened there, and it then somehow the era becomes completely natural. The two, it becomes very, very hard to pick them apart. If I think of the book that I'm about to publish in the spring, I was actually in a place wandering around an old church, and as I was looking at it, the idea came into my head, and the idea was very much set in a specific era. It's set in at the turn of the last century, so 1900, and there was never any doubt about that. Once I'd sort of come up with the place, it just, the whole thing sort of slotted together. It's very, very hard to pick it apart, and people always want to know, for example, where do you get your ideas from? And that is the $1,000,000 impossible question. If we all knew that, if we knew where they came from, we'd know where to look. in my case, they just happen. Things, I make connections, things come into my head, and sometimes I have to really, really ache my brain to figure out what's going to happen next. Next question's from Pat from Albany, and Pat asks, do you always write in the same place? Most of the time, Pat, I do. Most of the time I sit here at my desk and I stare at my screen, which I'm doing right now, and I pound away at the keyboard. But that is the work that involves actually putting the words onto the paper, but there's an awful lot of work that goes on outside of that. There's the research, which again I tend to do sitting here at my desk, but I will also go to libraries. I will go out on location and look at things. I go to museums, I go to galleries. And then sometimes I feel I need a change of scene. I'm not really someone who likes to go and work in a coffee shop because I find it too noisy and too distracting, and I end up listening to the conversations of the other customers. But I do like to get away, so sometimes I go on a locational trip and I stay in a hotel and write on the spot. Or sometimes one of my favourite places to go is a retreat just for writers in Devon in the southwest of England. And that is a fantastic place because they have about 5 or 6 people staying at a time, all writers. We get together over meals and often sitting around a blazing fire in the evening, and we all read out bits of writing we've been working on. And it's great fun and beautiful countryside to walk in. So it gets me out of my usual space. And the fact that everybody is sitting there just writing, locked away in their rooms, I find it really helps to concentrate my mind and help me to focus. Whereas when I'm here at home, there's just so many distractions, telephone ringing, doorbell going, etc. And the temptation to get sucked into doing other stuff like admin and marketing and things like that. Great question here from Sharon. She'd like to know what time periods I'm most interested in. And I would say that all my books so far have been in the 19th or 20th century. And I find them both really interesting because they're close enough to the current time for me to feel that I can empathise and understand what's gone on, but at the same time, or what kind of challenges those people are facing. But they're also times of massive, massive change. You know, the whole Victorian era with the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of internationalism and global expansion, and then the 20th century with the 2 wars, massive, massive change. That's not to say that I'm not interested in medieval history, the ancient Romans, the Greeks, etc. I love them all. I read about them. I'm fascinated. I go to exhibitions and museums, but I feel that there is a greater distance from me. And I don't know, that's not to say that I won't at some time write in those eras, but right now I feel comfortable with the 19th and 20th century. Sharon also asks, why do I always have tragic endings and people with unfulfilled love? I'm not sure that's the case. They're not always tragic endings. I try to mix it up a little bit. Certainly, Letters from a Patchwork Quilt was pretty damn hard, but certainly for one of the characters. But I try to have to build in a sense of hope and basically to get people to a satisfactory conclusion. But life is tough, and an awful lot of people don't have happy endings. You can, just looking around the world all the time, you can see that that's the case. And that's probably why I don't write straightforward romance, because it's mandatory to have happiness, wedding bells, etc. And I just don't find that as interesting as throwing challenges at people and seeing how they cope with them. And I guess as Tolstoy discovered before and said in Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, and therefore there's much more distinction, difference in plotting and discovering what are the factors that cause that unhappiness. And a question here from Barbara from Essex in England. She wants to know, what's the start point for my research? Is it the storyline or the history? And I guess it's both. I do quite a lot of general reading around the period or the location. Preferably original source material, diaries or accounts from people living in the times. But then as I'm writing, I also do a little bit of research as I go. So to give you an example, when I was writing Letters from a Patchwork Quilt, and I was trying to research, one of the characters is attacked and has her teeth knocked out and her face disfigured, and I wanted to know what solutions would be available to such a character at that time. So I took myself off to the Dental Museum and researched what kind of treatments would be available to people at that period in time. And then I also did some research around what kind of face creams, powders, etc. people could use to makeup, really, to disguise problems with the face. And interestingly enough, the book was set in St. Louis, and I found one of the earliest producers of face powder was a man called Joseph Bozzoni, who actually was based in St. Louis. So that was quite interesting. And I am not one of those people who does all the research before they sit down to write. I'm kind of doing it as I'm going along. Sometimes I will actually pause, and I know I shouldn't do this, I'll pause mid-sentence because I've got to know, I've got to check something out. I can't bear not to pin it down before I write it, so I'll often go off and check my facts and then come back and pick up the threads again, which is not ideal, but it's how I work. I have to do it. And then I go back, I double check. Things sometimes look a bit odd when I go back to them. That can't be right. I go back, I check again. And I write with a piece of software that enables me to keep all the research in the same place as the manuscript, and that's a huge help. Last question then is from Jane from Idaho, and it's, where will your next book be set and how did you decide? Well, my next book is going to come out in a couple of months, possibly a little bit sooner. It's called The Green Ribbons, and this book is set entirely in England, in the south of England. It starts off in Oxford and ends in the bulk of the book is actually in an imaginary place in the county of Berkshire called Nettlestock, but I did base it quite closely on a real place, a village called Kintbury, which is just outside Hungerford, and I used to have a cottage there, and so I know the place quite well, and I thought it would be a perfect setting. But I didn't want it to be Kintbury because I wanted to be able to change things around and add things as I wanted. So it's an imaginary village based on that. So hopefully that will be out in the next couple of months, and I hope you will all enjoy it and let me know what you think. And I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will possibly do another one at some point if you do enjoy it. Anyway, thank you very much for all your questions and happy reading.